Picture this. It's Tuesday night, just 90 minutes before a deadline that could have reshaped the entire Middle East. American B-52 bombers and the heaviest long-range strike aircraft in the United States arsenal are already airborne. The engines are roaring, the coordinates are locked, and the world is standing on the absolute precipice of an irreversible, catastrophic military engagement that would instantly unravel decades of fragile geopolitical stability. Hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications because what I'm about to walk you through is one of the most consequential 48 hours in recent geopolitical history. Let's set the full stage here. For weeks, the tension had been building, a slow boil of diplomatic failures, intercepted intelligence, and terrifyingly aggressive posturing that culminated in the ultimate nightmare scenario for the global economy. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. When we talk about this specific maritime choke point, we are not talking about a mere inconvenience or a temporary supply chain hiccup. We are talking about the absolute jugular vein of the global energy market. Let me put the numbers in front of you so you understand the extraordinary scale of what was at stake during these chaotic hours. The Strait of Hormuz sees roughly 20 million barrels of oil transit through its narrow waters every single day. That is nearly 20% of global oil consumption fundamentally trapped, kidnapped by an unprecedented military blockade. When that waterway shuts down, the global economy begins hemorrhaging capital at a rate that is mathematically devastating. Brent crude surged immediately, skyrocketing past thresholds that sent a stagflationary shock violently rippling through every major financial capital on the planet. Plunging markets began absorbing the terrifying reality that this wasn't a drill, and the United States knew that an extraordinary response was the only option left on the table. But before we get into the explosive climax of that Tuesday night, we have to understand the deeper structural forces at play here, forces that legendary investor Ray Dalio has been warning us about for years. Dalio's framework for the changing world order perfectly encapsulates this devastating moment. We are witnessing the classic signs of a declining superpower being tested by rising regional hegemons, a dynamic characterized by massive internal debt crises, polarizing domestic politics, and the inevitable external conflicts that arise when the old rules of safe passage are suddenly torn up. Dalio argues that when the financial systems are this fragile, a single geopolitical flashpoint can trigger a cascading, catastrophic collapse, and the closure of Hormuz was exactly the kind of trigger he anticipated. The internal intelligence briefings circulating in Washington during the initial hours of the closure were terrifyingly bleak. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, immediately convened emergency sessions, calculating that the loss of that 20 million barrels a day would not just spike prices, but would lead to physical shortages across Europe and Asia within weeks. The World Economic Forum warned of a compounding crisis where elevated energy costs would crush industrial output, creating a stagflationary shock so severe it would make the 1970s look like a minor market correction. Even the Dallas Fed released an urgent, localized assessment indicating that domestic shale production could not possibly ramp up fast enough to offset the devastating loss of Middle Eastern crude, petroleum coke, and refined products trapped behind Iranian naval vessels and hastily deployed sea mines. This was a scenario where the global economy was literally held hostage. So the United States did something huge. They initiated the opening phases of Operation Epic Fury, a massive, unprecedented mobilization of naval and air assets designed to forcibly reopen the strait. The Pentagon didn't just move a carrier strike group, they mobilized a coalition armada, telegraphing a willingness to unleash hell on Iranian coastal defense batteries, radar installations, and the very facilities suspected of advanced uranium enrichment. The strategic goal was to instantly grip the adversary with the reality of life or death stakes, establishing high tension and absolute dominance before the economic devastation became irreversible. The bombers were in the air. The targeting packages were authorized. The world was holding its breath. But here is where it gets interesting and where the narrative shifts from a purely military kinetic strike to a chaotic, behind-the-scenes 48-hour pressure cooker of diplomatic scrambling. The White House was internally split. On one side, the hawks argued that any hesitation would be read as terminal weakness, an invitation for further blockades that would completely reshape the balance of power. On the other side, the economic advisors, looking at plunging markets and the very real threat of a global depression, argued that a preemptive strike would guarantee a protracted regional war, ensuring the strait remained closed for months, if not years, due to the terrifyingly complex task of clearing thousands of advanced sea mines under hostile fire. This internal split created a paralyzing window of uncertainty. Now, let's get into the precise mechanics of how this explosive situation was abruptly halted just 90 minutes before the bombers reached their fail-safe points. It wasn't the United Nations that stepped in. It wasn't European diplomats. It was a chaotic, last-minute intervention by Pakistan. Recognizing the catastrophic fallout that a full-scale U.S.-Iran war would have on their own fragile economy and borders, Pakistani military and diplomatic channels opened a direct encrypted back channel between Tehran and Washington. This extraordinary diplomatic scramble was frantic, messy, and conducted entirely off the books. The Pakistani mediators delivered a stark message to Iran. The U.S. bombers were not a bluff, and the destruction of their military infrastructure, including their prized uranium enrichment sites, was imminent. Simultaneously, they delivered a message to the United States. Iran was willing to immediately stand down its naval blockade and agree to a temporary framework regarding the rules of safe passage, provided the U.S. aborted the strike and engaged in immediate mediated de-escalation talks. The clock was ticking down. 85 minutes, 80 minutes. The tension in the Situation Room was palpable. The decision to recall the heaviest long-range strike aircraft in the United States arsenal is not made lightly. It requires an immense leap of faith that the adversary isn't simply buying time to further entrench their sea mines or disperse their command and control. But faced with the devastating economic reality of a permanent stagflationary shock, the order was given. The B-52s turned around. The immediate, terrifyingly imminent threat of World War III was paused. But let me be absolutely clear, this was not a resolution. It was a fragile, incredibly messy ceasefire. And the falling action of this crisis is just as chaotic as the buildup. Almost immediately, there were fractures in the truce. Within 12 hours of the bombers turning back, a rogue Iranian fast attack craft fired a warning shot across the bow of a commercial tanker attempting to transit the strait. The markets, which had just begun to breathe a sigh of relief, instantly seized up again. Was the ceasefire already dead? Was Iran operating in bad faith? The reality, according to intelligence sources, is much more complex. This wasn't necessarily bad faith from the top. It was compartmentalization and a terrifyingly decentralized command structure, where hardline factions within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps were operating semi-autonomously, furious that the blockade was lifted. This is the danger of these high-stakes scenarios. Even if the leaders agree to a pause, the operators on the ground can still trigger a catastrophic escalation. And then came the Lebanon complication. Just as diplomats were scrambling to solidify the rules of safe passage in Hormuz, intelligence spiked showing unprecedented movements of advanced precision-guided munitions shifting into southern Lebanon, effectively opening a second potential front that threatened to drag Israel directly into the conflict. This was a classic asymmetric maneuver. A reminder that the conflict was not just about a single waterway, but about a vast, interconnected web of regional power dynamics. The United States, having just aborted a massive strike, now found itself stretched, having to continuously project immense power in the Persian Gulf while simultaneously surging assets to the Eastern Mediterranean to prevent the Lebanon complication from exploding into a full-scale regional war. Amidst this chaotic, hemorrhaging geopolitical landscape, Iran released a 10-point proposal through the Pakistani back channel. This document is a masterclass in diplomatic brinkmanship. It didn't just address the Strait of Hormuz, it demanded a fundamental restructuring of regional security architectures, a lifting of key economic sanctions that were crippling their domestic economy, an implicit recognition of their right to maintain certain thresholds of uranium enrichment. The 10-point plan was designed to be unacceptable to the United States in its entirety, but it contained enough nuanced concessions regarding commercial shipping and the temporary cessation of sea mine deployment to keep Washington at the negotiating table and, crucially, to keep the bombers on the tarmac. It was a strategic stalling tactic, allowing Iran to absorb the shock of the near miss while forcing the United States to navigate a terrifyingly complex diplomatic minefield. We are currently living in the immediate aftermath of this unprecedented near miss, and the situation remains incredibly fragile. The global economy is still reeling, the plunging markets are highly volatile, and Brent crude remains elevated as a persistent risk premium is baked into every single barrel of oil produced in the Middle East. The stagflationary shock hasn't been completely averted. It has merely been delayed, hanging over the global financial system like a sword of Damocles. Ray Dalio's principles are playing out in real time right in front of us. The rising power is testing the limits of the established order, utilizing asymmetric economic warfare, like threatening the jugular of global energy, to force concessions from a superpower that is desperate to avoid a catastrophic multi-trillion-dollar conflict. The debt cycles, the internal polarization, the shifting alliances, all of these macroeconomic and historical forces converged on a Tuesday night over a narrow stretch of water. So what do we watch for in the coming days to determine if this fragile ceasefire holds or if the entire region plunges back into the abyss? Let me break down the critical watch list for you, the absolute must-know indicators that will signal the next phase of this crisis. First, we have to monitor the physical clearing of the sea mines. The temporary agreement mandated that Iran provide maps of the hastily deployed minefields to allow for safe commercial transit, but any delay, any accidental detonation, or any refusal to cooperate fully will instantly trigger a resumption of hostilities. The rules of safe passage are meaningless if the water itself is rigged to explode. Second, we are watching the Brent crude futures curve with microscopic precision. If the market detects even a hint that the 10-point proposal is falling apart, you will see a massive, violent spike in near-term contracts, signaling that institutional money believes a second closure is imminent. Third, the Lebanon complication cannot be ignored. We must watch the intelligence regarding the movement of those precision-guided munitions. If that secondary front heats up, the United States may be forced to act in Hormuz simply to project deterrence across the entire theater. And fourth, we are watching the internal dynamics within Washington and Tehran. The hawks in both capitals are furious. In the U.S., there is massive political pressure to demonstrate that the aborted strike wasn't a sign of weakness. In Iran, the hardliners are pushing to resume the blockade to prove they cannot be intimidated. The tension is palpable, the stakes are existential, and the global economy is hanging by a thread. This is not a resolved historical event. This is a highly active, incredibly dangerous ongoing crisis that could unravel at any second. The decisions made in the next few days will echo for decades, reshaping alliances, rewriting the rules of global trade, and potentially triggering the exact kind of economic devastation that the world has feared since the 1970s. We have narrowly avoided the immediate kinetic hell of Operation Epic Fury, but the underlying structural conflicts, the changing world order dynamics, and the terrifying vulnerability of the global energy supply chain remain completely unresolved. The B-52s may have returned to base, but the pilots are still on standby, the target lists are still active, and the 20 million barrels of oil that flow through the Strait of Hormuz every single day remain the most contested, volatile, and consequential resource on the planet. I will be monitoring every single development, every diplomatic leak, and every market movement as this unprecedented situation continues to evolve. Hit subscribe.